welcome to our dissemination series from the LIFE DICET project on aligning ETS systems. We have the great pleasure of having Jos Delbeke today. Good morning, Josh.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here. Josh doesn't need introductions. He's absolutely well known within the entire European domain. But for those that are not from the European Union, let me just give a few highlights of his career. So Josh used to work and was the former general director for the European Commission DG Klima for 8 years. And within that time, and also he's still active now, he's been pivotal in defining European Union targets for climate and for energy. He was a key player in developing European legislation on the ETS, on domestic carbon markets. And he's also been representing the European Commission as chief negotiation under the UNFCCC. So thank you so much, Josh, for your time and for being here.
It's my real pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you so much. We're always very privileged because it's not only his knowledge, but also he's a very cheerful person, which we absolutely adore. So Josh, you've been part of our carbon market policy dialogues from the DICET project, and this was set as a way to offer a platform from stakeholders to discuss around the designing and the aligning and the linking of emission trading systems. But we know there are other platforms for offering stakeholders this dialogue space, and we would love to hear from you which are the platforms you've been working on and you would suggest the audience to also consider. Thank you, Josh.
Well, I think that facilitating the dialogue amongst stakeholders is absolutely critical to a success in any policy that the EU is bringing forward, because the EU is vast. We talk about millions of civilians, but we also, in institutional terms, think about 27 member states, and they all have their realities and they all have their, their setups that are very different. So having a good and structured dialogue is absolutely essential to explain in different formats to people what the intentions are, what the objectives are, what the way forward is, etc. So that's why the DICET project was a very important project, and I hope we can continue on the spirit that was created there. Now, there are several initiatives, from other sides. You have the lobby organizations, you have the think tanks in Brussels, etc. But what we have been doing in Florence together with the FSR is a quite important platform that we were able to create between those in the world having established emissions trading systems. And we talk about regions, nations like New Zealand, Korea. We talk about, of course, the EU, Switzerland, UK, but also about California, Canada. So we have an established dialogue. But what is unique about the Florence process, as we call it, is that also China is part of that debate. And it is a very informal debate. It is not on the record, but it is a very mature exchange of views between all those, struggling with the day-to-day, problems that a regulation like the EU ETS is bringing forward. So that Florence process took place already 7 times. It is normally taking place in Florence, of course. With COVID, we had virtual meetings. But last year we were together again in person in Florence, and that was a very good occasion. And that was combined with other things we are doing in Florence, also involving the stakeholders. We have the first week of May, we have the famous State of the Union conference, in which we had this year 4 major sessions on climate policy. And more than half of those sessions was on carbon markets. The carbon markets dialogue was put between the Florence process and the State of the Union event that took a lot of spectators, and we had a good attendance in Florence on voluntary carbon markets, on compliance markets, on carbon clubs, on carbon border adjustments, all things that are currently on the table. And we should continue that. And I think that what in Florence we try to contribute to the debate is a starting, developing a reply to more fundamental issues, not the day-to-day business. That's I would say, the job of those present in Brussels, in the institutions, etc. But we think over and prepare rather in advance some important basic issues. We did, I think, good work on the CBAM proposal. We are continuing the debate on carbon clubs, on linking, fundamental questions that have to be thought through based on the results of the academic sector, where pure economic and technical and modeling exercises are being done. So the policy preparation, in other words, is absolutely essential, and there the contribution of the stakeholders are so important. So we continue on that process, and we hope that Florence is going to be and continue to be a hub where people involved in carbon markets, either compliance markets and or voluntary markets, are going to come together in the future.
Thank you, Josh. I very much like what you mentioned about these dialogues being a bit of an avant-garde to support discussions that then policymakers need to consider and make it reality into policy so that they get implemented. So there is this space for these stakeholders to discuss these realities, also looking a bit more to the future needs and current implementation issues as a way to support policymakers. Wonderful. And actually also following with the State of the Union event, which was, as you mentioned, very well attended. We could see the world changing. We see the war in Ukraine. We see climate and biodiversity crisis. So in align with this future thinking, what do you think would be the fundamental changes that we can expect happening in the European Union emission trading system in the next, I would say, 10 years?
Well, that's a good question. And I think we are already preparing that future. We will see how we finalize it. But there are three elements I would like to bring to the fore to the discussion. And the first is that what we are going to do on competitiveness and carbon leakage is going to be a very important change. In the past, we were counting on free allocation. Now prices are so much higher. So the question about a correction at the border, the famous carbon border adjustment mechanism, I think is going to be a quite important game changer. It's already, part of the policy negotiations. We may finalize them in the coming months, but the way we are going to phase that CBAM reality in is going to be very important. And we know it's going not to work immediately, but it's going to take some years before it's really kicking in. So I think that's a very important one: carbon leakage, competitiveness, and of course the cooperation. The more we can do with other constituencies on carbon markets helps that debate very much forward. The second debate is also what we are already see happening, and that is that economists were concentrated on carbon markets, mostly on carbon prices. The incentive to reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide, that has been the predominant attention of economists. But now that the prices are relatively high and decent, the price level that we need to decarbonize our economy, the revenues raised from the carbon market are becoming so much more important. We have seen all the funds we created, the Innovation Fund, the Modernization Fund, the auction revenues to the member states have been multiplied by a factor 5 to 10. So the revenues and how to spend those revenues wisely is becoming a very important other question. And the fact that the Commission proposed in its efforts to repower EU, to get away from our overly dependence from fossil fuels from Russia, was a very important proposal that 250 million allowances would be brought to the market. That would create a revenue of approximately 20 billion euros that would be used to kickstart the low carbon investments that we need in the future. So again, using the revenues to get faster on the transition that we have to see happening in the coming years. So the second element, apart from the CBAM, would be the use of revenues generated through the ETS. And we know that the auction revenues every year going to the member states are already above 30 billion euros a year. So that's a very important source of revenue. The third element where I see the beginnings, but the early beginnings of a major change to the EU ETS is on the use of carbon removals. Because we know that over a decade, our emissions are going to go down, must go down so drastically that the EU ETS is no longer going to have emission reductions to deal with. And what we really will have to do is to offset that part that we are going to be unable to remove entirely. We will still use some fossil fuels, much less compared to what we do today, but there are going to be emissions that need to be offset. And how we are going to do that? Through carbon removals, through nature-based solutions, through the soil, through the use of our forests, to planting trees, etc., or through carbon capture and storage and putting the carbon in the underground. But the whole question is, these are all potentially expensive solutions. So the carbon market could create a reward for those trustworthy carbon removers. And I underline the word trustworthy because we know there are so many net zero commitments and offsets that are currently being done. And we all know in reality that a major part of those commitments are not as solid as we would like them to have. So the manufacture of the ETS as a solid compliant mechanism and opening up for the most solid carbon removals, nature-based or technology-based, is going to be a major piece of work for the next decade. We are not going to do it now already, but legislation will have to be prepared, I think, in the coming years. Let's say for the next review of the EU ETS, I bet that is going to be a very important element on the table. So for the next decade, I would say how we deal with offset, how we deal with competitiveness and leakage, how we deal with revenues, and third, how we deal with carbon removals may change the nature of the EU ETS significantly, but it has a solid infrastructure of tracking emissions, having a registry that is functioning well, having solidity in the system, and we should do everything to maintain that and to have the changes developed as I outlined over the next decade. So a lot of work on our table.
Absolutely, Jos, thank you so much for these insights. And actually, talking about revenues, we were discussing with the other interviewees on the 2% contribution of the Article 6 on projects that are going to focus on mitigation to be earmarked for adaptation fund. And I think also it opens up a bit these discussions about the forest being more than just carbon units and carbon players, but absolutely also contributing to natural carbon, natural capital with adaptation and other ecosystem services. And I think there is a space in this second action that you mentioned to also earmark other roles and other services from the forest. So I think it's an exciting decade coming ahead of us. Thank you so much, Jos, and have a good day.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
With a contribution from the LIFE program of the European Union.